Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Joining me is senior managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all our exclusive religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com//Mormonland. Now for today's episode. Lowell Bennion was among Mormonism's greatest humanitarians, while also being one of its most prominent thinkers and teachers. Indeed, he was among the few non-general authorities or officers ever to speak in General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As the first director of the Church's Institute of Religion at the University of Utah, Bennion spoke powerfully and courageously against the Church's temple priesthood ban on Black members and encouraged students to see science and religion as complementary rather than contradictory paths to truth. But he did more than teach or preach. Bennion created the Community Services Council in Salt Lake City to aid poor and marginalized populations. Eventually, a Center for Service was created in his name at the U, integrating service to the disadvantaged into the curriculum. Of the service he rendered, he once said, "I used to teach religion, now I practice it." Yet Bennion's life and work remain largely unknown to today's Latter-day Saints. Here to talk about the man, considered by many to be one of the founders of Mormon studies, is George Handley, professor of interdisciplinary humanities at Brigham Young University, who has just published an intellectual biography of him titled Lowell L. Bennion, a Mormon Educator. Professor Handley, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Peggy.
So what do you think made Lowell Bennion stand out in the 1960s? Tell our listeners some of his qualities and abilities.
Well, he was, at that point in his life, he was kind of at the prime of his life as a teacher. He was certainly at the top of his game, as it were, had been teaching very, very effectively for more than 25 years, and was also responsible for writing at that point many very important and well-used manuals for the church back in the day when that sort of thing was done. He was commissioned.
Sunday school manuals?
Correct. Sunday school and manuals for institute classes at the Institute at the University of Utah and other locations. So he was, and he was also a trusted friend of David O. McKay. And so he was, well known to the church. And as you mentioned, had been invited to speak on two different occasions in General Conference. He was, I think he established his moral authority over the years, also because of his extensive efforts as an instructor, as a teacher at the University of Utah, especially in the Institute, to bring students out into the community to do community service. And, as a sort of, it's interesting. It was certainly a very effective pedagogical tool, right? We now sort of have terms for this: service learning and applied learning and, internships and things like that universities use extensively now. And he was doing it very informally for many years. So he had really established himself as someone who not only had intellectual chops, but also, a strong record of humanitarian work. And that work, of course, continued for many years after the 1960s. But he had a strong moral conscience, and specifically a conscience about what he called social morality, and would often insist on the ways in which religion should impact the way we relate to contemporary life and engage in it, that religion should not be a shield that sort of, protects us from having to engage with the world, but it should be a motivation to jump in and roll up our sleeves and make a difference to improve the lives of other people. And I think that was extraordinarily attractive to students. And I think it's still, should be attractive to us today. And I think it's still an important Latter-day Saint legacy that he helped to build and contribute to. I think it goes all the way back to the 19th century, certainly in Latter-day Saint thought that, the gospel of Jesus Christ is about making this world a better place and building community. I think he was concerned that was getting lost. And so he gave a lot of emphasis to that.
Do you think wait a sec, Dave.
Okay, go ahead.
What do you think his education in Europe? It's certainly unusual for professors at the U to have studied abroad like that, I would say. Do you think that helped him stand out as well, or that it helped to form some of his ethical thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. He was, we're talking early 1930s is when he finishes his PhD. So he was among a very small number of, intellectuals in the church at that time who had PhDs. There were certainly a growing number of educators who were being sent out of Utah to be educated at different universities in the United States. Not all of which led to PhDs. And he went straight to the PhD in Europe. And he was there, as Nazism was on the rise. And so sort of, was very sobered by some of the things that he saw there. He was studying the thought of Max Weber, one of the founding figures of sociology. And he was really coming to understand a sort of more socially scientific way of thinking about religion and thinking about, his own Latter-day Saint experience. So he was extraordinarily well prepared to make a difference. And John Widtsoe, who was in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, tapped him as soon as he got back and said, we want you to, work in our church educational system. And so he went right to work. Now there were, tensions early on, all the way back in the 1930s, that had actually been going on even before Lowell shows up. That there was sort of a desire on the one hand for the church to send their educators out and get educated, but there was worry that they would come back with ideas that were, too secular and maybe somehow threatening to the tradition. So there was a deep ambivalence that he was encountering. Where on the one hand, he gets tapped by someone like John Widtsoe, and David O. McKay thinks he's, just a terrific person and really happy to have him. But then there are other leaders of the church and educators who are suspicious toward the sort of new trend of getting that much education and being that well prepared, and worry that maybe they wouldn't be as faithful to the, fundamental principles of the gospel. But Lowell walked that line, I think, better than almost anybody I've ever observed, in terms of how, how faithful he was to Scripture and to fundamental principles of the gospel. But he was not afraid to ask hard questions and to bring out the best in Mormonism. I think that was his goal all along. And I think he was extraordinarily well equipped to do it.
Can you talk a little bit, George, about the influence of his father on him?
Yeah, his father was Milton Bennion, was dean of education at the University of Utah for many years. He was also associated with the Sunday school board of the LDS Church. And so he had, friends in high places, both in higher education and in the LDS Church. And so he was very well respected. He wrote 2 books in his lifetime about ethics, and Lowell credits him for having educated him at an early age about he made special mention of the Sermon on the Mount. There was something about the way Milton approached the scriptures in a very fundamental way, kept his focus on fundamental principles of the gospel, and felt that they were especially well articulated in the Sermon on the Mount. And that kind of focused Lowell's attention. And of course, later when he gets his education in sociology and reads more theology and biblical studies, he sees a very common conversation around what is known as ethical monotheism, and the sort of the way in which Old Testament prophets build their case kind of toward the end of the Old Testament about the importance of social morality and responsibility for the poor, the stranger, and so on. And then that is, in his mind, best exemplified by Christ himself. And that he credits learning a lot of that from his father. And I think he also sort of, maybe by virtue of watching his father interact with church authorities and civic authorities and the powers of that were operating in higher education, I think he learned a great deal about how to navigate those waters with great grace and diplomacy, but with clarity and with humility. I mean, Milton was a well-respected, humble, but very intellectually strong person.
So one of the things that Lowell is most known for is opposing the church's temple priesthood ban, and he did it in opposition to a couple of apostles. Can you tell us about how that conflict, both how he handled it and what it cost him? Maybe set the stage for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. His style wasn't direct opposition in the sense that he didn't write op-eds, he didn't even write letters of protest. He actually would go straight to the person, right? But he wasn't afraid to do that in a public setting. The most famous setting was in the 1954. There's a big convention of church educators, and Marquis Peterson is presenting and talking about the priesthood ban and its justifications based on this idea of a premortal judgment that somehow people of African descent were subject to and therefore deserving of this restriction. And Lowell stood up and asked an honest question, and that was his style. He wanted to understand what the moral justifications were for the ban, in part, obviously, because he was convinced there weren't any, but he also wanted to engage in dialogue. He was a great believer in, open, transparent communication, and had written this. I quote him in the book about how he has this, in my preface, he has this confidence that if we can just keep talking, we'll come to an understanding. And of course, the church was less bureaucratic and a lot smaller back then. So, maybe these kinds of interactions were easier for someone like him to have. But he stood and asked Elder Peterson to help him understand why, how he could understand a punishment for a sin that a person doesn't even know they did, and then what's the justice of punishment for something that you can't remember doing and therefore have no opportunity to repent of. So he was kind of pointing out the absurdity of that logic, the logic behind this folk theology that had emerged in the church about the premortal judgment, a folk theology, of course, that the church has since famously renounced. But at the time, that was kind of the circulating understanding. And, it's not clear that anything changed as a result of that exchange, except that I think it must have had quite an impact on people listening, right? Even though it didn't change Elder Peterson's mind. He did something similar with Joseph Fielding Smith about the age of the earth and geology, because Smith was famous for insisting that the world was 6,000 years old, which was an outlying position. It wasn't an official position of the church, but he was very adamant about it. And Lowell, again, just sort of, he used his own son as an example and said, look, my son is studying geology. What would you have me tell him? I want him to, I don't want to drive him out of the church, and I don't want to have to force his hand and make him choose between what he's learning in his geology classes and what he reads in the scriptures. And Lowell, of course, had been more articulate than anybody about how to navigate the differences between science and religion and understand their different purposes and the different kinds of questions they were answering. And again, I don't think he got very far with Joseph Fielding Smith on that question in particular. But in both cases, his wisdom won out, right? I mean, I don't have the full understanding of exactly how that happened, but nevertheless, it certainly made enough people nervous. I think the main, as best as I can, it was an intellectual biography, so I didn't do nearly as much work as Mary Bradford had done to unearth these stories. But my sense is that it was Ernest Wilkinson who was really, and he may have been acting under some mandate from someone higher up, but he was already not only president of Brigham Young University, but he was the church education commissioner. So he was Lowell's boss, and he wanted Lowell to teach courses for college credit. Lowell didn't like that idea. He claimed he had a lot of respect for Lowell, and I think Lowell at times felt that, but at the same time, and I think that kind of was typical of a lot of the ambivalence he faced. He made people nervous because he was asking questions like that. And so eventually he's bumped out of the Institute in the early 1960s and is not ever given an adequate explanation. So we really don't, we don't have, some of it's just sort of guesswork in terms, and even his close friend, David O. McKay, would not offer an adequate explanation for it either, which I think was hurtful to him. But he buried it. He went on and didn't let that affect his relationship to his religious convictions, to the religious life that he wanted to live. And his son Steve told me that towards the end of his life, he regretted that story, as it came out in Mary Bradford's biography, probably overcharacterized who he was. He didn't want to be known as a martyr. He didn't want to be known as someone who was a troublemaker. Not to say that he was apologetic about the questions he asked, but I think he felt uncomfortable being a kind of symbolic figure for people. And I think he modeled a way of moving forward in an institutional context that didn't allow himself to get distracted from his own moral convictions and moral pathway that he had chosen for himself as a believer in Christ and as someone who sought to be a disciple. So I think he's pretty remarkable in that way, that he didn't he didn't let it embitter him. Even though I think it was very, very painful at the time to be knocked out of that position, and he did move on to work at the university and teaching in sociology and administration and student life. But his influence on hundreds of thousands of students. That's not hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands of students over many years had been, curtailed significantly after that point.
Can I go down the personal path with him a little bit more? He and his wife lost an infant daughter in a tragic way, and when she was just a baby. Did that influence maybe his life and his kind of compassionate views of humanity, I guess?
I don't have any evidence that he wouldn't have been, or, wasn't already a pretty compassionate person. But certainly I think he had a philosophy where he believed that things happened for one of three reasons. There was God's will, but there was also natural cause, and then there was human agency. And, their child died because of a safety pin that had been swallowed. I don't know the circumstances of how that happened, but, I can imagine any parent in a situation like that immediately goes to, what did I do to make that happen? What could I have done to prevent it? But then there's also sort of the question of biology and mortality that's part of natural law. And then there's sort of the question of God's will. And I think he was very sophisticated in seeing kind of a need to be careful about assuming too much about what we know are the reasons why certain things happen. Because when we rush to judgment about why things happen, as in the case of the ban on the priesthood, we sort of put a cloak over it, and we can't see our own responsibility, and we kind of end up attributing intentions or will to things that probably aren't very healthy for us, and can often block us from compassion. I mean, he was very, very adamant that blaming people who are poor, blaming people who are in suffering circumstances, is something that Christ certainly taught against. King Benjamin in the Book of Mormon teaches against, and so he was very adamant that is an unhealthy approach to the Christian life. So I think there's no question that shaped him in some significant ways. It's kind of stunning to me that he and his wife end up working on his dissertation within months of that happening and finishing it before they come home, which had to have been extraordinarily difficult. I sense it was understandably perhaps more difficult for his wife than it was for him. I don't know for sure, but it seems like he just kept going.
So, George, can you briefly explain the difference between Lowell's approach to education and J. Reuben Clark, who was in the first presidency? They have kind of stark differences. Can you explain a little bit about what those differences are and why you think Clark's view today is more dominant in church education?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a little bit of background on that. I'll try to give a brief summary, but in early 20th century, even going back to the late 19th century, there's a big debate in Christianity about the relevance of Christianity to, social life and to this world, right? And there's a phenomenon known as Christian modernism that emerges, where Christian theologians and thinkers are really pushing this idea that Christ called us to work in this world and to relieve suffering in this world for people around us, and that there is no moral sense in sort of turning a blind eye to the suffering of humanity and the hope for a better world, right? That comes after death. The problem was that some Christian modernists were pushing it so hard that they were kind of moving toward a denial of the supernatural elements of Christianity. They were sort of less interested in worrying themselves, for example, about whether or not Christ was really the redeemer of humankind through the suffering on the cross and through the atonement, whether or not salvation of sins from sins was an issue that Christians ought to be so worried about. And J. Reuben Clark saw those trends and like a lot of other leaders at the time, worried greatly that if LDS educators went off and got educated in this kind of Christian environment, they might come back to Utah and begin educating students in a way that downplayed the significance of the unique doctrines of the Restoration. So he gave a speech in 1938 in which he insisted on the loyalty of church educators. And I don't think Lowell had a problem with loyalty except that he would probably qualify it, or he did qualify it by simply saying that, sustaining church leaders and loyalty to the church does not rise above individual conscience. Individual conscience doesn't rise above communal commitment either, but there has to be a balance, right? And there has to be a balance between what one is asked to be loyal to and whether or not one is being asked to be loyal to squares with what we know fundamentally about the gospel. So, in a situation where church leaders are asking loyalty, for example, to a doctrine that's not really doctrine, it's not scriptural, and it doesn't square with the full teachings of Jesus Christ, as in the case of the ban on the priesthood, then he didn't feel like that meant I had to be loyal to that position. I can sustain the people and I can sustain the institution, but I don't have to be vociferously defending something that I can't defend. But he also, he was in the middle of writing his very first manual for the church, The Religion of the Latter-day Saints, which was published in 1939, just on the heels of Elder Clark's talk. And there's lots of ethics in the book. And Clark had specifically said, we don't need our church educators talking about ethics. And, to a 21st century ear, there's very little commentary on that from its users today, which I find strange because it's a very strange comment. Like, why would we be concerned about teaching ethics? Of course we want people, the scriptures are full of the injunction to act on what we believe, that we can't be hypocrites and so on. So, but he was really reacting to that climate. And I think Lowell just decided, I'll see if the merits of my own ideas carry their own weight, and I'll write this book. And if this is not persuasive to people, then I guess I lose the debate. But he didn't get any particular pushback. And when he started bringing students out into the community to practice their religion, he didn't get any pushback either. So in some ways, he was showing a very highly successful alternative to what Elder Clark was worrying about. And yet Elder Clark's talk was then resurrected. I mean, it didn't have the kind of authority that it has now, oddly enough. It kind of got resurrected in the 80s by Boyd K. Packer. And, this became kind of the mantra of church education, again, sort of focusing on this issue of loyalty, but very little is ever said about the ethical question that Lowell picked up and ran with and was so successful with. So I think in the end, there's a lot more to say, but in the end, J. Reuben Clark really wanted a very protective wall built around church doctrine, and he didn't want any secular influences. And Lowell was always saying, look, if you silo religious doctrine and religious teachings away from the context of the world that students are in, you're forcing them to choose between doctrine and the world that they live in. And at some point, that's going to break them. They're not going to stay in the church because they're not going to feel called to the circumstances that surround them. And so he thought church education's purpose was actually to perform that integration, to help them see the connections between their religious beliefs and the doctrines of the church with the variety of disciplines they're being exposed to in higher education and with their lived experience. And that was the work of education. I think we're still trying to sort that out. I don't think, as a church educator myself, I think I've certainly, along with a lot of my colleagues, have tried to do that kind of integration every chance we can, but it's hard work, and it's not always clear what the pathway forward is. And yet we still continually hear worry about, don't get too secular, don't water down the doctrines, don't water down the supernatural ontological claims of our religion. They matter too much. Lowell was never interested in downplaying, the reality of Jesus Christ as a savior of humanity. He was not interested in downplaying those things, but he didn't think they deserved all of the attention for their own sake. The Book of Mormon's importance wasn't just that it was it claimed to be a restored account of Christ coming to the Americas. It was valuable because it taught us how to live in the 20th century.
So, George, I want to ask us a question. It might be somewhat speculative on your part. Again, forgive me, but Lowell Bennion said that the church should be at the forefront of civil rights movements for all groups. How might he have approached LGBTQ issues, since many of those became more prominent after his death?
That's one of the big questions I would love to ask him if he were still alive, because that and what he would think of climate change are two issues I'd love to have a conversation with him about, because he didn't say much about either, right? It's well known, of course, that he had a gay son. Mm-hmm. And he treated his son, I think, very humanely, although in his biography, he, by some accounts, was devastated by the news that his son was gay at the time. But he responded with enough compassion and love toward his son that, he actually ends up having his son build a home and live on his property in Salt Lake City with his partner, and goes to a, church court, as they were known, disciplinary council to defend his son against excommunication and plead for mercy, even though those pleas went unheeded. So I don't know. I talk a little bit about this in the book. It's hard to see any evidence that he saw homosexuality or human sexuality in its plurality in the same way that he saw race. I think one can argue that the doctrines of Mormonism are more overtly heterosexual than, and so that makes it a little like a harder doctrinal case than it was for him to say, the ban on the priesthood just doesn't make any sense. But there's no question in my mind that he would have been at the forefront of compassion and listening and learning and being cautious about the damage that church policies and practices do to individuals. I think he was always a people first person when it came to his approach to every institution, whether it was governmental, educational, or religious. And so I think he would be calling attention to the impacts that certain ideas and practices have on individuals. And I think he would be trying to find ways. I mean, it was his life mission was to help individuals flourish, right? That was his mantra throughout his entire life. So there's no question that he would never turn away from somebody to say an idea about who you are matters more than who you actually are as an individual. And so he would never, I don't think he could ever have turned his back to that community or to what their experiences were. Where that would have led exactly, I don't know, or how he would have voiced those concerns. I think we can gather that he would have voiced them with diplomacy, with respect, but seeking honesty and transparency above all, and dialogue. And I don't think I think it's pretty obvious that we need all of that right now in the church to help us.
You write about this, but I wanted to ask you another question about his legacy of service and his emphasis and example of service and how it might have even helped shape the church's present expansive and global humanitarian work.
Yeah, I think there's got to be, there's got to be, in some ways, yeah, I reflect a little bit about how he, not that he was ever seeking vindication. In fact, after the ban was lifted in 1978, someone asked him and maybe it was you, Peggy, in your interview, I can't remember, but somebody asked him, do you feel vindicated? And he kind of said, I'm really not interested in vindication. I've got other things to worry about. So he just, was always kind of moving forward. But there's no question that, in terms of things he said about education, about honesty and transparency, about science, about humanitarian service, all of those things to some degree or other are still not only around in the church, but have actually picked up some steam. And whether or not that's because of his influence is hard to say, but, it's certainly in my mind does. Again, he was not interested in vindication, but it does tell me he got it right. He lived the gospel as well as anyone I've ever known. And I think doing so with his individual courage and faith is a testament to me of the power of, being as careful and circumspect and deliberate about his understanding of the teachings of Christianity and finding ways to implement them in his life. So I think he would find great satisfaction in seeing the humanitarian work of the church today. He'd probably push for even more. And I think he would find great satisfaction in, the church reaching out to the NAACP and other efforts that have happened, the gospel topics essays. I think he would see a lot of positive developments. But again, he'd probably be, saying, okay, keep going.
So after writing this book, what do you see as his greatest contribution to the life of Latter-day Saints?
Oh man, there were so many, I just felt so strongly as the most pleasurable part of the whole project was when I just got all of his books, excuse me, and just read them, for a period of several months and took notes. And I just thought everything he's saying is so valuable to the contemporary church. And it kind of hurt to think about how little known his writings are and how important they would be to us now. And I felt, of course, a personal debt of gratitude having met him and known him when I was a young person in my late teens and early 20s. So I don't know which one I would pick, but I think maybe it's just sort of this idea of the hopefulness that he saw in Mormonism and in the restored gospel for opportunity and possibility to be a tremendous force for good in the world and to make tangible, lasting differences in actual living circumstances of people, that Latter-day Saints could be not just people who are, as the old primary song, or maybe it's a Sunday school song, dreaming of their mansions above. But they were forgetting themselves in service. They were forgetting themselves in the call to, love justice and mercy and to serve their fellow human beings with all of their souls. That's how he lived his life. And I think that's what moves me the most is that. And I will say for him, it was comprehensive. So it wasn't just, I need to be kind to the person I'm assigned to be kind to in my church context, or I need to be kind to people within my church, but not worry myself about society. It's that sort of all-inclusive, comprehensive call of service to the world that I find so remarkably inspiring about him. And I think we desperately need, not just in the church today, but in the world. I mean, or at least in our American culture, there's a sort of isolating individualism that we're suffering from. We're terribly distracted by entertainment and meaningless activities. And we're not tending to one another's wounds and one another's needs like we should. And I think that is maybe one reason why we have such high rates of depression and anxiety, why there's so much, battle with perfectionism and so on. I think he just had such a healthy understanding that everyone needs to feel called to a meaningful life and needs to find that path.
One last question. I want to talk about a particular audience. How might especially young Latter-day Saints today benefit from Lowell Bennion or a Lowell Bennion-like figures?
Well, I think I've just alluded to a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think the call to work and to service. I should mention, the Boys Ranch that he founded, that I was a camper at and later a counselor at, was founded on those really two principles: that learning how to use your body to actually do physical things and to do them for other people or for a common cause is extraordinarily healthy. He didn't see his camp as some sort of like self-help thing, or it wasn't designed to help troubled kids, but it certainly helped every single one of us who participated in it to avoid problems or to mitigate problems we were having, because it got us out of ourselves. It gave us confidence in our ability to work together. It gave us confidence in our own power and agency. And I think something in that is missing in a lot of young people's lives right now. But I see at BYU with my students, they are extraordinarily hungry for a meaningful life. They are, and many of them are going forward with great force and power to live it. I just hope the church catches up to them, right? And gives them a space inside of the church to marry their convictions about, doctrinal matters with their convictions about wanting to alleviate poverty or to help the environment or to, build good organizations that do good in the world. There's so many idealists among the students today. And I think if they don't see, it kind of gets to the heart of what Lowell understood. If students don't see a connection between their religious life and the way in which their education is calling them to service in the world, they may just go ahead and do that service, but without the outside of the context of the church, right? And that would be a loss for the church. It would be a loss for our community. I think we're better for understanding ourselves as, attached at the hip together as brothers and sisters in trying to alleviate suffering and to do good in the world. And I think that's a great call. I think that's very inspiring to a lot of young people today. And I don't think too many people have an argument with that, right? Whether they're religious or not, people might get bent out of shape about religion or about religious beliefs that they can't accept. But most people are willing to work together with religious folks, people of religious conviction, who use those convictions to do good in the world and partner with others to bring those things to reality. So I think I just think that's a healthy way forward for religion in the 21st century. I don't think we can afford to be merely focused on salvational questions. I don't mean to suggest that those don't matter, but I don't think those are as inviting or as exciting to young people.
The name of the book is Lowell Bennion, a Mormon Educator. George Hanley, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for your interest and for those great questions. That was fun.
Thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.